Hey there students, thank you for being part of this presentation. My name is Luis Silva. Today we're looking at world history, the Cold War, 1945 all the way to 1991, and this is part 4. What will we learn today? Today we're going to learn about the Cold War in the 1960s and the 1970s. We are going to compare and contrast the reforms of Khrushchev and Gorbachev. Let's move on. Joseph Stalin led the Soviet Union from 1927 all the way to 1953. When the Cold War began, Stalin spread communism into satellite nations in Eastern Europe. Stalin escalated the Cold War by creating the Berlin Blockade in 1948, and also under Stalin, the Soviet Union tested the atomic bomb in 1949 and the hydrogen bomb in 1953. Stalin signed a treaty of friendship with Mao Zedong after the Chinese Revolution. Joseph Stalin wanted to make sure that he was in good terms with the Chinese in this case. Stalin sent weapons to communists in North Korea during the Korean War. So you can see Stalin was involved in many parts of the world, becoming really good friends with Mao Zedong in China and also being there for the North Koreans by providing weapons. Joseph Stalin's death in 1953 changed the Soviet Union and how it approached the Cold War against the United States. New Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev began a series of reforms known as de-Stalinization, which included releasing political prisoners and also relaxing censorship. Khrushchev initially seemed willing to work with the United States to ease Cold War tensions, but tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union actually escalated throughout the 1950s and also the 1960s. Under Khrushchev, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik and the space race began. The creation of intercontinental ballistic missiles led to the stockpiling of nuclear weapons during the arms race. In the year 1961, John F. Kennedy became the President of the United States. Kennedy and Khrushchev faced two important crises that heightened Cold War tensions. First, building of the Berlin Wall, and second, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev was upset with the increasing number of communist East Germans who moved to democratic West Berlin, and therefore he decided that the best way to fix this was to build a wall. In 1961, Khrushchev threatened to cut off access to West Berlin like Stalin did in 1948 with the blockade. President Kennedy promised to protect West Berlin, but rather than a blockade, the communist leaders built the Berlin Wall to keep East Germans out of West Berlin. You have this image here in which you see what communist leaders did in order to separate communist areas of Germany and those areas that were democratic. Here we have an image of the Berlin Wall. Here we have an image when the Berlin Wall was being built and people were being separated. Here we have more images. Sadly, walls only serve to separate people. Here we have another image of two groups of people that were most likely friends throughout this conflict, but a wall separated them at this point. Here we have the Berlin Wall, which became obviously the iconic image of the Cold War, in which a wall was built to separate two groups of people. Unfortunately, throughout history, politicians don't learn, and even today we have politicians trying to build walls to separate people. Walls and other barriers 10 to 15 feet high, surrounded West Berlin. The length of the barriers around the city totaled about 110 miles. The death strip stretched like a barren moat around West Berlin, with patrols, floodlights, electric fences, and vehicle traps between the inner and outer walls. Very sad situation, very sad story. Again, how people are separated. When Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba in 1959, the United States feared the spread of communism so close to America. If you can look at this map, you see that Cuba is basically right next to the United States. And this was a serious problem for the United States. After a failed attempt to overthrow Castro, Khrushchev secretly sent nuclear missiles to Cuba. The United States had tried to overthrow Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro initially was not a communist, but he saw that the Soviet Union, the Russians, could protect him from being overthrown, and therefore he formed alliances with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in response, liked the idea of having Fidel Castro as a friend, and they actually placed missiles in Cuba that would easily target the United States. The United States successfully blockaded Cuba, and Khrushchev removed the intercontinental ballistic missiles in exchange for the removal of American intercontinental ballistic missiles in Europe. And here we have once again a map of Cuba and the United States. As you can see, the United States is in close proximity to intercontinental ballistic missiles and possibly nuclear weapons. This is why many Americans were very afraid, but everything worked out when the Soviets removed those missiles from Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the United States and the USSR came to nuclear war. From 1965 to 1973, the United States became involved in Vietnam. When communist leader Ho Chi Minh gained independence for Vietnam, the United States feared communism in Southeast Asia. Vietnam was divided into a communist north and a democratic south. In South Vietnam, communists, known as the Viet Cong, worked to unify North and South Vietnam and were aiming to have the entire country of Vietnam become communist. To contain communism, the United States sent troops to Vietnam starting in 1965. If you look to your right, you see how the United States slowly became involved in this part of the world, and it got to a point when more than 500,000 troops were there. The American military used bombing raids, pesticides, and search and destroy missions to fight the communists. Here we have airplanes dropping bombs. Here we have a helicopter which is basically dispensing pesticides. Here we have an image of search and destroy missions, in this case to fight the communists. And here we have injured men. Despite these efforts, the United States was unable to defeat the communist enemy in Vietnam. The Vietnam War was expensive, it hurt the United States economy, and became unpopular with anti-protesters in the United States. In 1973, the United States withdrew from Vietnam, and 2 years later, communists unified Vietnam. In other words, the United States lost the Vietnam War as communism was able to take control of the entire country. America's failure in Vietnam led to a change in Cold War policies. The United States abandoned its containment policy and began looking for ways to improve relations with Cold War enemies. In the 1970s, President Richard Nixon's policy of détente, or easing Cold War tensions, replaced brinksmanship. In 1972, Nixon became the first United States president to visit and recognize communist China. You have the image to the right, the picture. There is Mr. Nixon, Here you have Mr. Nixon again, walking in a place in China. Here we have Mr. Nixon visiting the Great Wall of China. Nixon's visit to China put pressure on the Soviet Union to negotiate with the United States. And in 1972, Nixon was able to meet with Soviet leader Brezhnev to discuss arms reduction. The United States and the USSR signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or better known as SALT, which limited the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles each nation could have. By the 1970s, the United States and the USSR seemed willing to peacefully coexist, but détente ended in 1979 when the USSR invaded Afghanistan to put down an anti-communist uprising. The United States viewed the attack as an attempt to spread communism into South Asia as well as the Middle East. As a result, the United States cut off all trade with the USSR and sent military and economic aid to Afghan rebels. One of those groups that was fighting the Russians was the Taliban, which have a long history with the United States. You're more than welcome to read a little bit about the Taliban to your right of this presentation. The Soviet Union fought in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989, but was unable to defeat the Afghan resistance. Remember, the resistance was being helped by the United States. The war exhausted Soviet economy and proved as unwinnable as Vietnam was for the United States. The war renewed tensions between the United States and the USSR. In the 1980s, new president Ronald Reagan helped win the Cold War against the Soviet Union. President Reagan's strong anti-communist policies and the collapse of communist economies brought the Cold War to an end by 1991. The Cold War came to an end, and the United States was left as the only superpower in the world. We have come to an end of this presentation. Please make sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next presentation.